In this video, let us discuss service strategy. Service providers. Types. There are three types of service providers. Type 1, internal service provider. A Type 1 provider are service providers that are dedicated and often embedded within an individual business unit. The business units themselves may be part of a larger enterprise or parent organisation. Business functions such as finance, administration, logistics, human resources and IT provide services required by various parts of the business. They are funded by overheads and are required to operate strictly within the mandates of the business. Type 1 providers have the benefit of tight coupling with their owner, customers, avoiding certain costs and risks associated with conducting business with external parties. Since Type 1 service providers are dedicated to specific business units, they're required to have an in-depth knowledge of the business and its goals, plans and operations. They're usually highly specialised, often focusing on designing, customising and supporting specific applications or on supporting a specific type of business process. Type 1 providers operate within internal market spaces. Their growth is limited by the growth of the business unit they belong to. Each business unit, BU, may have its own Type 1 provider. The success of Type 1 providers is not measured in terms of revenues or profits because they tend to operate on a cost recovery basis with an internal funding. All costs are borne by the owning business unit or enterprise. Type 2. Shared Services Unit. Functions such as finance, IT, human resources and logistics are not always at the core of an organisation's competitive advantage. Hence, they need not be maintained at the corporate level where they demand the attention of the chief executive's team. Instead, the services of such shared functions are consolidated into an autonomous special unit called a Shared Service Unit, SSU. The model allows a more devolved governing structure under which SSUs can focus on serving business units as direct customers. SSUs can create, grow and sustain an internal market for their services and model themselves along the lines of service providers in the open market. Like corporate business functions, they can leverage opportunities across the enterprise and spread their costs and risks across a wider base. Unlike corporate business functions, they have fewer protections under the banner of strategic value and core competence. They are subject to comparisons with external service providers, whose business practices, operating models, and strategies they must emulate, and whose performance they should approximate, if not exceed. Customers of Type 2 are business units under a corporate parent, common stakeholders, and an enterprise-level strategy. What may be suboptimal for a particular business unit may be justified by advantages reaped at the corporate level for which the business unit may be compensated. Type 2 can offer lower prices compared to external service providers by leveraging corporate advantage, internal autonomy to function like a business unit. Type 2 providers can make decisions outside the constraints of business unit level policies. They can standardise their service offerings across business units and use market-based pricing to influence demand patterns. A successful Type 2 service provider can find itself in a position where it's able to provide its services externally as well as internally. In these cases, they're both Type 2 and Type 3 service providers. In these cases, it's important to make a strategic decision to provide services both externally and internally, and to set up the appropriate governance and management structures. This is not just a case of delivering existing services externally. Service providers. Types. Type 3. External service provider. A Type 3 service provider is a service provider that provides IT services to external customers. The business strategies of customers sometimes require capabilities readily available from a Type 3 provider. The additional risks that Type 3 providers assume over Type 1 and Type 2 are justified by increased flexibility and freedom to pursue opportunities. Type 3 providers can offer competitive prices and drive down unit costs by consolidating demand. Certain business strategies are not adequately served by internal service providers, such as Type 1 and Type 2. Customers may pursue sourcing strategies requiring services from external providers. The motivation may be access to knowledge, experience, scale, scope, capabilities, and resources that are either beyond the reach of the organisation or outside the scope of a carefully considered investment portfolio. Business strategies often require reductions in the asset base, fixed costs, and operational risks, or the redeployment of financial assets. The experience of Type 3 providers is often not limited to any one enterprise or market. The breadth and depth of such experience is often the single most distinctive source of value for customers. The breadth comes from serving multiple types of customer or market. The depth comes from serving multiples of the same type. From a certain perspective, Type 3 providers are operating under an extended large-scale shared services model. They assume a greater level of risk from their customers compared to Type 1 and Type 2. But their capabilities and resources are shared by their customers, some of whom may be rivals. This means that rival customers have access to the same bundle of assets, thereby diminishing any competitive advantage those assets bestowed. How to define services. Below are the steps which we need to consider while defining our services. Step 1. Define the market and identify customers. Step 2. Understand the customer. Step 3. Quantify the outcomes. Step 4. Classify and visualize the service. Step 5. Understand the opportunities, market spaces. Step 6. Define services based on outcomes. Step 7. Service models. Step 8. Define service units and packages. Step 1. Define the market and identify customers. In this context, a market can be defined as the group of customers that are interested in and can afford to purchase the service a service provider offers, and to whom the service provider is able legally and logistically to supply those services. The first step in defining services is to understand the market in which the service provider operates. This will help to narrow down the options open to the service provider. For example, a Type 1 service provider will typically only serve one business unit. Their entire market consists of a single internal customer. A Type 2 service provider's market will consist of several business units. They will not typically define and provide IT services outside of the organisation. If they do, they're usually automated business services. A Type 3 service provider cannot provide a limitless number of services to every market. They typically either provide a generic service to several markets, e.g. internet services to residential users and small businesses, or they provide specialised services to a single market, e.g. monitoring and controlling for manufacturing. Markets can be defined by one or more criteria, such as the following. Industry, e.g. manufacturing, retail, financial services, healthcare, transportation, and so on. Geographical, e.g. a specific country or region. A service provider may provide a best-in-class service but decide to limit its availability to a single geographical region. A different service provider may provide a lower standard of service but delivers it consistently across multiple regions, making it easier for customers to standardize on a single provider for all regions. Demographic. The service provider may deliver a service geared towards a specific cultural group, e.g. television programming for a Spanish-speaking customer in the USA, or a group of customers with similar incomes, e.g. luxury or economy services. Corporate relationships. Some service providers have specifically been set up to provide services to a group of companies with a common shareholding and may not market those services to competitors of those companies. In all cases, identifying the markets in which the service provider is active is an important part of identifying which services the service provider will deliver and to which customers. In some cases, identifying the customer will be the same as identifying the market. For example, a Type 1 service provider or a supplier that provides support for a specialised system in a specific location. If they are the only service provider of this type in the location, then all organisations using the system are potential customers. Step 2. Understand the customer. For internal service providers, understanding the customer means understanding the overall business strategies and objectives of the organisation and how each business unit meets them. It also means understanding the business outcomes that each business unit needs to achieve. For an external service provider, understanding the customer means understanding why they need the service they are purchasing. The service provider does not have to understand the detailed strategy, tactics, and operations of the customer, but they do need to understand the reasons the customer needs the service and what features are important. Understanding the customer involves understanding desired business outcomes. The customers use their assets to achieve specific outcomes. Understanding what these outcomes are will help the service provider to define the warranty and utility of the services and to prioritise service needs. Customer assets. Services enable and support the performance of the assets the customer uses to achieve their business outcomes. Therefore, it is necessary, when defining services, to understand the linkage between the service and the customer assets. Constraints. Every customer asset will be limited by some form of constraint. A lack of funding, lack of knowledge, regulations, legislation, etc. Understanding those constraints will help the service provider to define boundaries for the service and will also help the customer overcome or work within many of them. How value will be perceived and measured. Customers always measure performance, quality, and value. Many service providers set up complex monitoring and measurement systems without understanding how the customers measure the service. This results in a misalignment between the customer's expectations and the service provider's actual delivery. It is therefore vital that the service provider understands how the customer measures the service, even if the service provider is not able to measure the service in the same way.